Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Ashton Kingdon, who is a lecturer in criminology at the University of Southampton and the author of the new book, The World White Web, Uncovering the Hidden Meanings of Online Far-Right Propaganda. Thanks for joining us, Ashton.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be here.
Well, you're always welcome with puns like this.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I think when I was last on, I was talking just about the occult. So it's great to be back to talk about how it evolved for the book.
I guess just to begin with, this book's just come out. It is open access, so if people want to get it, it's available online. What was the impetus for putting it together?
Yeah, so it is open access, but some people have had problems finding it. So if you can't find the PDF, do just send me an email. I've been happy to send the book out. So I guess I originally started off my career doing Islamic State propaganda. And I was always really interested in the way that audiovisuals were used and the seductive natures of that propaganda. And then, so I actually started my PhD with funding for Islamic State research. And then I guess that must have been 2019. So obviously we're getting into the arena of there being these really high profile acts of far right terrorism. And there was so much propaganda coming out. And I remember I was at a conference and I was talking about this platform I'd infiltrated, which was called Fascist Forge. And I was like, oh, there's so much going on here. I think it's really important. And they were like, yeah, no one's really working on this on the far right. You should really look into this while you've got access. And it was from that I really switched my focus. So yeah, I'm really interested in the role that technology and imagery play in accelerating the radicalization process. And I think that it just happened that moment in time where I was studying, which was really between 2019 to 2022, was this period of time that was marked by these significant terrorist attacks, these societal upheavals. You know, you had all these elections, this rise of support for far-right populist parties, COVID, and then the aftermath of George Floyd just unfortunately provided so much content for the book that it became specifically about how platforms, movements, parties, propagandists, individuals were utilizing that medium for recruitment on such a wide scale. And a key thing of the book is really talking about the fact that the threat of the far right is the network, with the current danger really lying in the evolution of this network that's accelerated by technology rather than it being any individual group, a party or a specific movement being the problem. It is this networked aspect of it. So that was where it came from. Unfortunately, the moment of time. And the book, I finished writing it last year. I thought things were going to die down a bit. And obviously now it couldn't really be more relevant than ever to have this material out there.
Ashton, to gather the material, as you mentioned, you infiltrated Fascist Forge, but you created a number of identities and sort of went out there to collect material. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was and what that was like?
Yeah, so I've always done undercover work, mainly because I was really interested in how the technology accelerates communication, but also this relationship between the fringe and the mainstream and how content was moving between the two via the technological mechanisms or the architecture of that. So I have always been embedded within, and because I did Islamic State first, I had a lot of experience on how to get into networks and how to be within them safely. So I had a number of identities for the 4 years I was researching, which included kind of being a radical right populist. I was an eco-fascist. I was inside accelerationist, neo-Nazi and fascist networks. So that would be like the Atomwaffen division, the Sonnenkrieg division, trad wives, QAnon conspiracy theorist. I was in the Klan and what we would call in Europe identitarian groups. I spent a lot of time in there. So in America, that would be predominantly known as the alt-right, but a lot of networks that were focused on white nationalism specifically, and this idea of preserving the nation state, which COVID really accelerated. So yeah, I spent a lot of time on I think I probably went on every platform you can imagine, which ranged from sort of the dark web to alt tech, to mainstream, to fringe, just to see how techniques of radicalization were potentially comparing and contrasting. So I spent a long time inside these spaces. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this was during, unfortunately, some really key moments in history where things were becoming particularly polarized. So it was really interesting to see fringe mainstream shifts based on changes in, say, what was going on in politics or big social events, and then dealing with the backlash of that. Like even with the book, I published it and I've got severe campaigns of trolling. So when you write about specific spaces, the far right don't like it. And that's part of the consequences, I guess, of doing this work and then publicly writing about it. So that was definitely something that I had to come to terms with when I started researching the far right and writing about it in certain spaces, that it does leave you open to networked harassment. And I've done a lot of work in the book. You know, it talks about the emotional, mental health implications of researching these spaces and doing this work. And it provides a framework or suggestions for other people that might be doing this. Because certainly when I started, there wasn't that much around about researcher safety. Now it's got much better. So I wanted my book to specifically be about researcher safety for imagery and people that might be looking at specifically video, audiovisual propaganda, because the risks, I think, from imagery are much different to that you might get from text, particularly if you're doing kind of computational analysis text.
Ashton, one thing that occurred to me is, can you draw any comparison between the kinds of visual imagery and the propaganda that was being produced by Islamic State and the sorts of things you discovered when you were monitoring these far-right networks? Because it seems that the appeal in both cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the audience is young men online. So in terms of the visual imagery that's produced by either or both, what is it about that imagery that does appeal to particular audiences, and why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I definitely found some parallels between ISIS and the far right, particularly in terms of their tactics that they would use. I think that when you're thinking about today and how people are going to try and get people to believe a certain narrative, tapping into what the audience would want is really important. So, I mean, if you just look at the recent American election and the way that TikTok was used in songs and aesthetics, like dark MAGA, is so popular with the youth because it's something they can latch onto and it's a trend and it's something that's cool. So with my ISIS research, I always argued that people joined ISIS because it was cool. It was sexy. They knew what they were doing. Their propaganda was slick. They were appealing to demographics that other groups before them hadn't necessarily been able to tap into as effectively. And you don't only see this with the way that they use certain things. Like there's a huge correlation between the use of video games, not just the way that they shoot their attack videos. So, for example, there's a huge rise in research around gamification. So applying gaming elements to non-gaming scenarios, essentially. And you see the Christchurch shooter shooting his live stream like in the format of a video game. And you saw this with ISIS, the way they would shoot their videos and the way that their propaganda becomes like leveling up, getting a kill count, those vibes. That's very much intertwined with what people might want to see. And they react very quickly. So as soon as a game comes out, I mean, just recently I was tracking the new release of Grand Theft Auto 6. And the far right latched onto it immediately for Trump propaganda. Like, as soon as the trailer came out, there were so many memes, clips of the videos. Like, they move really quickly. And I think that's part of how they can attract certain people. And obviously, the book focuses a lot on alt histories. So these are the alternative versions of history that propagandists use in order to create certain narratives. They might cherry pick certain things. I mean, the far right today are obsessed with looking to this imagined past in which Europe in particular was considered pure as the basis to really reconstruct this idealized future in which their vision of a white ethno-state would flourish. And you saw the same narratives around the Taliban retakeover of Afghanistan. It was very much content around this being an ethno-state. You know, Afghanistan for Afghans and Europe for Europeans was a very heavy propaganda narrative, specifically using the same epochs around the Crusades. So I see a lot of tit for tat propaganda on that, where they'll use the Crusades because it's one of the most famous historical examples of Christendom versus Islam. And they represent it as this consistent clash of civilizations in their propaganda narratives. And you do see this with ISIS and the Taliban and also with the far right. And they will often use the same characters as well. So they might use Saladin, for example, in both of their... I talk about this in the book a bit. They might use him as in both imagery-focused pieces of content because they're popular figures that people are more likely to know. So you don't see an overlap with the Christchurch shooter, for example. One of the things I did in my doctoral work, which is what the book is focused on, is really look at all of the different symbols, names, dates, figures that he had on his weapon system. And you can even track each of those battles from both sides. So I obviously did it for the far right's narrative, but you can also do it for Islamic State quite clearly based on very public, historical, documented propaganda that they will replicate. So it's really interesting to see that. But I get asked all the time because there's been a shift in the borrowing from each other. So ISIS, for example, have released propaganda that features Pepe the Frog. And then you can see far-right propaganda that features Bin Laden. And I get asked all the time, is this they're taking each other's ideology? And I'm like, no, you're reading way too much into this. It's literally the aesthetics. So if it fits in with their aesthetics and it fits a certain style, it's more likely to be used because it's effective in recruitment rather than they're swapping ideologies or side switching.
Ashton, speaking of old history, how often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Well, I think about it a lot more since last night. For anyone that is listening to this and doesn't know what we're referring to, I'm talking about Elon Musk doing the... I've seen a lot of content today trying to justify it as being the Roman salute. But I think about the Roman Empire a lot because I see it a lot in propaganda. I mean, they are a bit obsessed with it, I'm not going to lie. But yeah, I think about it an awful lot, unfortunately.
Could you tell us a bit about what is it about the Roman Empire that fascinates these people so?
Yeah, so, I mean, in the book, there's a whole chapter on antiquity, mainly because my PhD, I am half a historian, so it's got to be in there. So ancient Greece and Rome, in particular for the contemporary far right, they're portrayed as these exclusive foundations for Western civilization. So they they use ancient Greece and Rome to create this narrative that draws a direct line from their Roman Empire to now modern Western European countries. So Western civilization in a way has also become a code word for whiteness. So just like if you are knowing much about sort of Nixon's Southern strategy, Reagan, this war on drugs, where crime began to stand in for race, you see this a lot now with Western civilization. So when people are talking about Western civilization, they're often talking about white civilization, but it's a way that they can code and cloak it more so it doesn't necessarily get picked up by automated content moderation systems. But these civilizations, say ancient Greece and Rome in particular, have always served as this inspiration for the far right. You see this in classic Italian fascism as well, who manipulate and weaponize this history as a way of portraying the ancient world as exclusively white. So they use this in propaganda a lot, and these classical narratives of whiteness and power are promoting this toxic blend of white supremacy and misogyny together. So even following the election of Trump, there was this huge wave of generated content, AI-generated content, where they were portraying Musk and Trump as Roman legions. So the AI is set up, and if you go on platforms like Gab, there's large language models that you can interact with. So if you think like ordinary people might use ChatGPT, there's specific large language models that are dedicated to like famous Roman emperors that you can have conversations with. There's generators where you can create specifically Spartan imagery, Roman imagery. So that's something that is really important for them because it's such a heavy aesthetic. What you see quite often with propaganda today is this obsession with using certain aspects of the Roman Empire. In particular, they'll use the aquilus, the eagle, in their propaganda quite heavily. So this was this powerful Roman symbol that was representing Jupiter, strength, this idea of immortality. And it served as this primary insignia for Roman legions. So losing it in battle was considered to be an ultimate disgrace, and it demonstrated this profound military and cultural significance. And in the book, it actually tracks the evolution of this eagle symbol throughout different time periods and epochs, and even through the Nazi era. So often they badge this with SPQR, which stood for the Senate and the Roman people. But historically, this was a civic rather than a military symbol. And it was designed to represent shared governance between citizens and elites. But far-right groups, as I said, they often cherry-pick things. It might be a symbol, it might be a figure, and then they'll twist the narrative as a way of reinforcing this support for the ethno-state. So they often misinterpret this SPQR as a symbol for military dominance and imperial power, rather than it being something to do with the ordinary citizens. So together, they will often use symbols and code words to promote these idealized narratives about, in particular, European racial and cultural purity, but intertwining this with military strength and masculine power. And this is altering differently from their historical meanings. So what we saw last night in the Trump inauguration parade is obviously Elon Musk was doing the CKL, the Nazi salute. And I've seen a lot of people today backtrack that and be like, oh, no, it's the Roman salute. So I found this so much with what I was researching. History is consistently used as a defense mechanism for the people that are engaging with fascist or national socialist ideology online. They'll be like, I'm interested in history. I'm a historian. That's why I'm looking at this. That's why I'm doing this. So I've seen a lot of mainstream newspapers as well try and defend this as a Roman salute and not a Nazi salute. The idea that this is a Roman salute is actually a huge misconception that was very much a product of modernity as well. There's actually no evidence historically that's factual that says that Romans ever used this. This is very much a product of like theatre productions and art, particularly that emerged through the 19th century. So again, it's just a way that they're trying to carve this link and then back that up with some sort of historical justification for this obsession with the Roman Empire that they need to recreate it. And that's what these symbols are, when in fact they're not. They're actually just very overt white supremacist symbols.
Ashton, two questions, I guess, occur to me in this particular context. One is obviously those on the far right, or those who consider themselves to be on the far right, aren't the only ones who express concern over the fate of Western civilization. It's a concern for many on the right and perhaps outside of it. What does this say about the relationship between, as you discuss in the book, the mainstream and the margins of the right? And the other question is, what does it mean for someone like Elon Musk, the world's richest man, to appear in public conducting this so-called Roman salute? What do you think the political effects of that are, given one of the, I guess the focus of the book is the importance of the visual on the political field?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's 4 key things that the book really looks at. So technology, the role of emerging technology in particular, the power of imagery, the relationship between the fringe and the mainstream, and then the weaponization of history. So that's a really good example. So I'm obsessed with visuals. I always have been. In the book, it very much centers on an example being for anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. You could tell someone was Jewish because they wore a hat. And this imagery was depicted all over England in stained glass windows in cathedrals that are still there. So this is, if you think about during this time in the Middle Ages where people couldn't read or write necessarily, people got their ideas about what was good and bad through visuals. And it's really interesting to me that there's been no conversations about potentially removing any of that, because the book talks a lot about the Confederate symbols, right? And this need to remove them. And the argument that comes around heritage versus hatred and the way that they're used by the far right is this bolstering of the old South narratives, right? And I just found that really interesting. So the book, when it talks about this, is really, it builds off of Aurélien Mondon and Aaron Winter's work on reactionary democracy. So their idea of a liberal racism appears a lot in the book. And the idea that when you're talking about the far right visually, they're often represented in their most illiberal ways, things that have been seen to be out of time and out of place in our liberal Western society. So things like, if you're talking about the far right, you might represent them as a Klansman or the Confederacy or Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, right? Something that is considered to be defeated. So in a way, the book really focuses on the modern contemporary ideas of what this might look like and the way that that's coded and cloaked. So I actually argue slightly differently to Aaron and Aurélien and talk about the mainstream and fringe actually working in unison. And COVID really drew this to me as a point of concern. So I was inside a lot of eco-fascist communities during COVID, particularly when the world was shutting down and going into lockdowns. And there was all of this propaganda around nature healing itself and the idea that we are the virus. And, because we'd all taken stock and no one was moving around, it was actually showing that humans were the problem. And I was seeing it in real time that people were being legitimately concerned about resources because people were panic buying, people didn't have access to basic things. And then that tipping into neo-Malthusian ideas really quickly about overpopulation. And it was really interesting to see mainstream in the UK newspaper articles and imagery then being shared back into these neo-Nazi accelerationist and eco-fascist communities. And vice versa, content from that was then coming into the mainstream because people didn't know what they were sharing. So there might be these, I talk a lot in the book about runes, and I worked with a runologist to decode what they were actually saying in their runes. And quite a lot of the time that was being shared back into the mainstream without any awareness or knowledge of what was actually going on. And I think for me, that's really problematic because now all across platforms like Facebook, Instagram, you have these spaces that on the surface don't seem problematic at all because they're coded and cloaked around these idealized versions of what things should be. in terms of where people should live. And the environmental crises like climate change, what was happening with COVID, combining with resource scarcity, was really exploited by the far right to promote ideas that link race and space together with ecological stress. So it becomes a way that they can want to militarize borders more, shut down migration to preserve these spaces. And you would see things like blood and soil ideology popping up in contemporary cottagecore, TikToks, gardening, wellness communities. And people had no idea that they were sharing this. Now, and the thing that I really want to make clear in the book, because I get asked this a lot when I present things at academic conferences, is that it's not necessarily the image that is the problem. Like, the imagery alone is not a problem in a lot of these cases, right? People living in the countryside, women wearing a particular type of dress, cottages, that's not problematic on its own. It's the relationship between the hashtags. So the hashtag concordance, the ability for them to overlap with problematic content. And then the algorithm pulls people very quickly into different types of communities. Then people start discussing with one another, and then they can get pulled into particular subcultures. But on the outside, it's the imagery that is the most powerful component of that. And because it's moving between these fringe and mainstream communities, often without the audiences being aware, that's when it becomes more problematic, particularly because the more coded content isn't going to be on a social network, like say a GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism. It's not going to be on their hashing database. They can't pick it up automatically as being problematic because it's just a cottage. So it's the way that they code and cloak that enables it to move. And I think, in my opinion, that's the most problematic component, because everyone that uses social media is subjected to potential misinformation and disinformation. And it's something that affects everyone.
I saw just today, Ashton, with all of the changes in content moderation that are happening at Facebook, and obviously Twitter took the brakes off a little while ago. People saying, at least, there is still that hashing. So most of the time, the Christchurch video isn't being posted on Twitter, and they do get around to taking it down, as if that was sort of like,
yeah, that like get around to it. So we get to it eventually. I mean, it's been 5 years, but yeah, we'll get there.
It seems like maybe the people saying this were trying to be diplomatic because they still have to try to work with the platforms, but it seems like you've got to be doing a little bit more than just taking down the terror content. It's the problem is what led to the terror content.
Again, I was hoping that things were going to get better, and it seemed like they were, but it's not. It's getting a lot worse. There's a whole chapter in the book that talks about it's socio-technical and multi-stakeholder approaches to countering propaganda. So it goes through different things. A lot of it focuses on tech platforms like law enforcement, digital literacy, counter narratives, AI regulation, the fact we don't have any international regulation. What's happening at the moment? Okay, first of all, my one big bugbear is, because I've heard this a lot in the aftermath of the Southport attack in the UK, is that people constantly conflate misinformation and disinformation together. They're very separate things, and they need to be treated as such. And I think that's part of one of the problems, is that when you're talking about misinformation, which I generally think we have more of a problem with, that can't be treated in the same way that you would treat a sophisticated AI-based disinformation campaign coming from Russia, for example. You can't treat ordinary people sharing things about a certain attacks or like certain narratives about COVID in the same way. So that's why the book really talks about this focus on like digital literacy and getting people to understand this. Now, what we've seen over the past month or so since Trump got re-elected is already this move in regulation. So in America, for example, you've got Section 230, which means that the platform itself isn't responsible for the content. So if you think about part of the issues around what we've seen post Christchurch in particular, and also post the attack in Pittsburgh, is this move to alt tech in response to censorship, right? So platforms, particularly post 2019, have really started to clamp down on far-right content, which meant people moved to alt tech platforms. Now, these are decentralized social networks, which means that you yourself are in control of that content. So if I went to Gab, for example, and said, I've seen all this really horrible anti-Semitic stuff, can you please take it off? They'll be like, we have no control over that. Like, that's not coming down. So you see this movement in who owns the content and who's responsible for it. So in the UK, for example, we're very much regulated by Ofcom, and they will go after the big platforms through the online safety bill. So the platforms are in a way responsible for that. Now, in America, Section 230 means that the platforms are not responsible for the content. So it's the individuals that are responsible. Now, that's problematic in itself already, particularly if you're thinking about people being able to post what they want under freedom of speech legislation. Now, Trump has publicly said that that is going to get even less restrictive. And now we've seen this move with Meta to moving to community notes, so getting rid of legitimate fact checkers. So the reason that I'm personally so concerned about this is most of the work that I look at is on the more coded and cloaked aspects that are circulating from the fringe to the mainstream and vice versa, often without people realizing what they're doing, as I was saying. And now if you're getting rid of a basic, I know it's not moving over here to the UK yet, but if you get rid of a basic way that could potentially be warning people about misinformation, and then the communities themselves are talking about whether or not it's misinformation, I just think that is just baffling to me that could be something that is happening. And I always sort of start my talks at the moment with talking about the fact that Geoffrey Hinton, who is the godfather of AI, quit his job at Google because he was talking about the fact that AI is rapidly evolving too much, that we don't have control over it anymore. And he specifically talks about the fact that AI generated content and imagery is a key part of this. It is a threat to democracy. It's evolving too quickly, and that is going to be deeply problematic for everyone. And, you know, I get asked a lot, like, oh, what is the actual relationship between this cottage and then terrorism? Like, do you honestly think that someone's going to watch a TikTok of cottagecore and then go and, you know, commit a mass shooting? I'm like, no. But I genuinely think that the ability for propagandists to tap into emerging technologies and use that to manipulate people to vote for certain people, to think certain narratives, is much more problematic on a larger scale. And I think that, you know, the move to community notes, the restrictions becoming more lenient on platforms on what people can see, what people can access, how people engage with misinformation is just going to cause absolute carnage, in my opinion, over the next few years.
As you've noted, Ashton, there have been policy changes at Meta. X has seemingly abandoned all sorts of measures that were
normal.
Yeah.
Measures, yeah.
To the extent that addressing the World Wide Web depends upon the cooperation of a handful of tech billionaires, assuming they're not willing to come to the table or come to the party, what other, I guess, measures might be appropriate? Some have discussed, you know, one of the structural problems being the fact that there are so few men controlling so much. Is there do you think that, you know, some form of anti-monopoly legislation or measures might help improve the health of the web?
Yeah, so like in the book, it talks a lot about, I focus a lot on AI just because it is a lot about emerging technologies. So it really talks about the fact that, number one, we need to have a global AI regulation that involves everyone. And that's part of the problem at the moment, is that everyone needs to sit at the table and not everyone wants that, right? But you would have to have a situation where everyone was involved, which includes the players that a lot of people don't necessarily want, like Russia and China. that's part of the problem with this global regulation would be, because you got to not just think about this in terms of AI, but also the quantum internet is rolling out. That's not actually regulated at the moment. This could be catastrophic, and you would need everyone to agree on things. You also have this situation where different countries have different legislation around what platforms can do. So it's problematic because a lot of the time the burden falls to the tech companies to sort this out, right? And law enforcement will be like, that's your problem. And then the tech companies can do their best, but part of the problem is that the content evolves so rapidly, everything changes so quickly. I mean, just even watching the Trump campaign on TikTok, every day it was like a new trend or a new aesthetic or a new song that was coming out. It's really difficult to stay on top of that in terms of a regulatory aspect. I personally have never been one that has been very positive towards technologically deterministic responses. And I often think that a lot of it is too reactionary. So it might be that there's a huge attack and then all of a sudden platforms are like, oh, we need to cull this one type of content, which is why I advocate so heavily for things like digital literacy. And in the book, I've got examples of how I've personally done that. And it's not to say that my way is the best way or that this is the way everyone needs to do it. But I was just giving examples of how I have done it where in a local context, which is like getting into schools, getting into colleges, getting involved with local communities. I do a lot of, in the UK, we have Prevent. It's given a bad rap for good reason, but they are the people on the ground helping in the communities. And if they don't know what's going on, and they don't know potential radicalization pathways, particularly through things like gaming, aesthetics, the key figures, then they can't help in the communities either. So I think I spend a lot of time creating resources that then go out to colleges in the local areas, and they tell teachers, parents, students what the potential threats are, particularly in terms around elections, content, platforms, key figures. In the UK, it's a lot of focus around Andrew Tate. And because Andrew Tate converted to Islam, now Prevent aren't allowed to discuss him like as openly as they would be before because of their history of Islamophobia. So it's about getting people to know potential risks in the community, because when you think about digital literacy as well, a lot of the time, teachers, parents, the children or young people's use of digital literacy outweighs the parents, if that makes sense. So if they don't know how they can help, then how can you possibly tell people about these risks? So as I said, the book isn't telling everyone that this is what needs to happen. It's saying this is an idea and we all need to work together more if we want to prevent something which I think quite catastrophic is happening. I mean, now we're at a stage where things I talked about in the book in terms of QAnon propaganda, the narratives, these were all very fringe 2 years ago. Like I was talking about really fringe components of the internet, 8chan, things on the dark web. And now I'm seeing them on Twitter, on Facebook, on TikTok, being put out by people like Elon Musk, the Trump campaign, and now we've got a platform where the inauguration, someone is doing a Nazi salute, and that's where we're at. So I don't think that trusting X to clamp down on moderation is going to help, which is why I go personally down the kumbaya, let's all work together route, which I know isn't loved either by a lot of people.
That is all we've got time for. Ashton, thanks so much for coming on. The book is The World Wide Web. It's available open access through Palgrave, or you can get in touch with Ashton if you want a copy. She is on Blue Sky at ashkingdon.bsky.social. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Andy, that is our program. We'll be back next week. See you later.
See you then.
Sunday, 26th of January, marks Invasion Day, and 3CR's First Nations broadcast team will be bringing our annual Invasion Day broadcast to the airwaves between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. We will be broadcasting live from Camp Sovereignty and throughout the day, bringing you voices of the elders, truth-telling, critical discussions with grassroots activists, deadly music, and honouring warriors past and present in the struggle for land back, an end to the genocide, and a sovereign treaty. So keep it tuned to 3CR on Sunday, 26th of Jan from 9am to 4pm. Brr.
You might have heard about the Community Radio Plus app, but it's only when you start using it that you'll wonder how you lived without it.
You can listen to us wherever you are, at home, work, driving,
on public transport, gardening, protesting, or even in the bath.
Just search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.